Now, during the meeting at the White House, Brazil announced it would waive visa requirements for U.S. citizens. And President Trump floated the idea of adding Brazil as the latest member of NATO. So joining us to break this all down, we're being joined now by Director of Communications at the Institute for Public Accuracy, Sam Husseini. Sam, good to see you.
Good to be with you.
So NATO was originally designed as a Cold War alliance. And as we know, it's supposed to be no more. The Cold War is supposed to be over. It's now evolved to sort of counter terror threats across the Middle East. Where does Brazil fit, or how do they fit into all of this?
I think all of those contradictions highlight that its stated goals are not its actual goals. The original pretext was it's a defensive alliance against Soviet expansionism. After the Warsaw Pact collapsed, and the Soviet Union itself dissolved, NATO didn't disband, it expanded.
Right.
Now to the borders of Russia. After the total Cold War pretext was gone, it didn't pull back, it got bigger. It started bombing Afghanistan after 9/11
Right.
as a pretext. It went after Gaddafi in Libya, and now you have slave markets in Libya. The idea, he's mocked in the Washington Post and else, and by New York Times, people on Twitter for suggesting this. Trump is, but actually Colombia is already a partner
Right.
with NATO. So the idea that Brazil, which does border the Atlantic, and NATO has obviously gotten out of, at least in some respects, its North American
Yes.
confine, North Atlantic confines. It's not so outlandish, and I think it also highlights this episode, the way that Trump criticizes NATO while actually backing it to the hilt. His past criticisms of NATO, saying it's obsolete and so on, what did they result in? They resulted in European governments saying that they would pony up even more money
Yes, that is
for
true.
NATO. That was the net result of it. So there's this twisted back and forth between Trump and the rest of the establishment, where he, takes some of the rhetoric of criticizing the establishment, but it actually ends up building up the establishment in some ways similar to what Obama did from the other side of the political spectrum. So the idea that he would, with this kindred spirit, a right-wing
Right.
pretend populist, shall we say, enhance militarism, and so on. He's obviously, getting too far ahead and saying a NATO member.
Right.
But, we don't know. I mean, everybody's talking about the Venezuelan, attempted coup or whatever having failed. What's our timeline here? I mean, it took over a decade between the Iraq initial bombing in '91, and we just saw the anniversary of the invasion.
I was going to say, today the anniversary.
You got to use scare
Right.
quotes with the word anniversary, and in that case too, you saw a lot of the Democratic Party establishment, Joe Biden most prominently, who was head of foreign affairs at the time, bolster that, vote for it. Squash people like Scott Ritter from testifying effectively. So the idea that Trump will bolster the establishment, I think, is not at all far-fetched, as we're seeing here, as he's pushing the mechanisms of the establishment, like
Right.
NATO,
So
to
this isn't a
become
wild-
even more expansive.
Right, so it's not a wild thing for him to throw out there. A lot of people are making fun of him, saying that he's wildly throwing this out there. It's not beyond the question of beyond the realm of reality.
There's a certain honesty to Trump in terms of
Whether we like him or not,
the brashness with which he states, when he
Right.
talks about Venezuela, why don't we take their oil? Why don't we take their oil? Well, sometimes that is what the U.S. establishment does. It just typically does
true
it more.
intent.
It does it more quietly than he
Right.
does.
Now, you mentioned Colombia. Colombia in NATO, and now maybe potentially Brazil, both of these countries, key U.S. allies against President Nicolas Maduro's government in Venezuela. Would you couch this as a direct move against Maduro?
It's definitely a threat. I don't know if the U.S. Establishment and Trump are actually gunning for Maduro, or if they're just trying to put so much pressure that
It forces him out, maybe?
It makes life incredibly uncomfortable for him, and I don't know what timeline they're talking about. You know, to say that, oh my gosh, it's been 2 months and they haven't forced him out already, therefore they have quote unquote failed.
Right. What is the?
Well, what is failure? I mean,
benchmark?
I'm not convinced that the U.S. failed in Syria. It caused a failed state in a once relatively prosperous Arab states. I'm not convinced that they failed in Libya, where a relatively independent, if idiosyncratic,
Sure.
leader is out, and now you have a failed state. What are the actual goals and what are the stated goals?
Right. What are the timelines that consider?
What are the timelines? What are the goals in terms of keeping Venezuelan oil off the market? The U.S. is now a major oil producer.
So what benefits does Bolsonaro, what would he see from on his perspective? What does he see that he'd get out of this, growing alliance from the U.S.? What does Brazil benefit?
I'm not an expert on Brazil, but certainly possibly some more high-tech weaponry, if he has an interest in that sort of thing.
He's offered Trump a base in Brazil before.
Okay. Increased economic ties and collusions between the elites in Brazil that probably immediately surround him, and elites that, especially those that immediately surround Trump, as well as others. I can see a whole host of benefits.
So it sounds definitely just kind of more of the same, more of the same establishment stuff, but with newfound rhetoric and bluster.
Bluster, but an unpredictableness and a poignancy that has a definite, right-wing component that is more racialized and that is therefore conceivably more dangerous.
All right, we'll leave that right there. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. Sam Husseini.
Thank you.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.